this morning we're going to do something a little bit different than kind of the norm. One of the things that often what we've been doing on Sunday mornings is we have been preaching, we do a little bit of a devotional during the live stream, and then we have a recorded message afterwards. And when I'm the one doing the devotional and the recorded message, often what I've been doing is I've actually been recording. I've been sort of doing like a little bit of an intro as the devotional, and then I do the recorded message. And so this week, that's sort of what I was doing. And I started writing that, and started heading along down that kind of plan there. And usually it's like the devotional's maybe a page or two, and so it was a page or two, and then it was 3 pages, and then it was like 4 pages, and usually like my message is only about 6 or 7 pages, and so all of a sudden I kind of realized that it was just sort of growing, and so I just kept going. And so today there's no recorded message, and we're going to do the whole thing live this morning here at the Bent House. Because it's more fun to do it live, because it's a lot easier when it's easier when there's all of the distractions that exist in this room, as opposed to like when I can do it without any distractions at all. It makes it more of a challenge then to do it live on Sunday morning. So we're doing a new teaching series. So if you caught the recorded message last week, then you know that we're going to start a new series looking at the fruit of the Spirit, and kind of this idea of sort of the anti-fruit of the Spirit. This idea that we're often choosing one path or the other. This idea that it's not just a question of sort of not living our lives the way Jesus taught us to, but usually because we're making an active decision to kind of go a different direction with that. And so we're kind of going to be looking at that, these sort of counterfeit things that we chase after, and these sort of counterfeit things that we chase after instead of the good fruit that the Holy Spirit wants to produce and grow in us. And so we're going to look at Galatians chapter 5, verses 22, because I want to kind of refresh that in our minds, and it's kind of thing that's probably a good idea for us to memorize. Paul says that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against things like this. And so this week, what I want to do is I want to look at love. So I was walking my dog this past week, and I got thinking about Jesus' words in Luke chapter 6, because that's what I do when I'm walking my dog. I get thinking about Jesus' words in Luke chapter 6, and specifically where Jesus says this in Luke 6, 27 and 28. He says, "But I say to you who are willing to hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you." Now, I was not so angry with Lexi that she was my enemy in that moment or anything like that, but this is kind of what was going through my head. That's a rough passage of Scripture, right? That's one of those passages of Scripture that often we don't really want to listen to. We don't want to hear that all this stuff about praying for loving our enemies and praying for people that hate us and all this kind of stuff. And then I got thinking about like what this is actually saying. And so the first thing I got, like, do you have any enemies? Like, do you have enemies? You know, I was trying to think if I have actual enemies. Like, do I have people who I would consider my enemy? I don't think I do. Like, that's a pretty big word, right? The definition of enemy is one that is antagonistic to another, okay, especially one seeking to injure, overthrow, or confound an opponent, something harmful or deadly. Hopefully I have no deadly enemies. But then I got thinking about, there was like one dude a while ago in our denomination who had sort of made it his life's mission to try to get me fired. I don't know, maybe that's kind of like an enemy, I guess. I don't know. But then Jesus wants me to love him. I'm not thrilled about that. And then I was thinking about the hate thing either. I'm not sure about like hate. Do you have anybody in your life that hates you? Do you hate anybody? I asked this question to a bunch of people this week. Like, do you hate anybody? And a bunch of us were having a hard time trying to come up with like somebody that I hate, like that I might actually feel that strongly about. And anybody that hates me, that would be rough to know. It would be rough to know that somebody hated you. Like if somebody hated me, That'd be hard to actually have to think about. And even rougher to actually and actively be supposed to do good for people who hate me. So I'm supposed to love my enemies, and now I got to do good, expend energy thinking about good things that I can do for somebody that hates me. And then to actually have somebody cursing me. Right? Cursing me. Now, this is not like cursing you, like saying bad words, naughty words about you. This is like witchy kind of like cursing you, like voodoo doll kind of cursing you. Somebody who's actually wishing harm, wishing doom upon you. And in this particular time that Jesus was talking about, may have gone to one of the temples to pray for your harm to their particular god. Like, that's a pretty intense thing. And Jesus is asking me to then bless them. I don't know about that. I'm not super thrilled about that. And then finally, there's the whole pray for those who mistreat you. Now, I want to be very clear. The context is that is to pray blessing on those who mistreat you. You don't get to go to what are called the imprecatory Psalms in the book of Psalms and start praying those like rain down fire on them kind of prayers. This is supposed to be the pray for their blessing, pray for good for them, that kind of stuff. So, what does all that have to do with me walking Lexi? So as I was walking Lexi this week, she was in one of her I have to pee on everything in the world moods. And it was starting to get a little bit frustrating because we couldn't take more than a couple steps before she wanted to pee on something again. And I was starting to get frustrated because it was hot out and I wanted to come home. And so I was starting to like yank on her leash to get her going. And every time I would pull on her leash, she would immediately kind of pull back against the leash. And it turns out that that's actually a thing. It's called the opposition reflex. And it's a thing that animals have, and it was discovered by Dr. Ivan Pavlov. Yeah, totally. Like, you remember the, like, ring a bell and I'll salivate. How'd you like that? Yeah, it's that dude. So the dude who was doing all those experiments with animals, and the Pavlovian response, he found they have this thing called the opposition reflex, that when you pull on the leash, the dog instinctively will pull back against it. Even if they are happy to go with you. In fact, I remember even when we first got Lexi one time, trying to pull her towards her food dish, and she loves her food dish, but as soon as I pulled on the leash, she backed away. And then you could see this look on her face like, oh no, I've backed away from the food. I want to go to the food. And then she walked over just fine. And that's when I started to realize like it's actually a reflex. It's this instinctual thing. Kind of like the same thing when you go to the doctor. Not that the doctor pulls on your leash. That's weird. No, like when the doctor hits your knee and you get the little weird reflex thing, right? It's the same kind of deal. And the harder you pull, at least the more they will resist, at least initially. Here's what I got thinking about. I got thinking about all of the fights that are going on at the moment in the world, right? I mean, it's crazy. Everything seems to be a fight these days. Everything seems to be a huge fight. I mean, like, think about it. Masks, vaccines, racism, politics, opening the economy, whether or not we should go back to school in the fall, pick an issue. Everything seems to be a huge fight. Everybody takes extreme positions on all of these, and everybody seems to be so angry. A kid's friend the other day was going into a store wearing their mask. Oh, they had their masks on because, it's the law now. And they were going into the store, and some guy was standing there screaming at everybody going into the store because he was calling them sheep or something. Like, there's so much anger and hatred, and it's crazy, all this stuff going on. Everybody's seeing each other as, like, the enemy. Everybody's seeing each other as like they're somehow on opposite sides of some kind of war. That's what hate does, That's what hate does. Hate makes people the other. There's a philosopher named Martin Buber, and he was famous for dealing with all of this kind of stuff. He was famous for dealing with all of this idea about relationship and how it all works. And he had these kinds of ways of talking about the other. And he said sometimes in relationships, we end up in a relationship where it's I and it. We actually turn the other person from a person into an object. We make them less than human. And I can't think of anything less in line with how God created us than to strip somebody of their humanity and to make them nothing but an object. to make them something that we see as less than. But this is how we let ourselves hate. That's how hate works. In order for us to hate, we have to somehow strip the humanity of the other. We look, when we begin to allow hate into our lives, we start looking for something in the other person that we don't like. We start looking, we're actively seeking out the wrong in them. We're actively seeking out what we feel is less than in them. We're actively looking for what we believe to be abnormal in them. And we turn them into an it instead of a human being. Last week, Carol Ann put a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King in that video that she made for us for the devotional. And it's a famous quote, and it's been used a lot lately on the internet. And Dr. King says, returning hate for hate only multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. You see, I started thinking about this thing with Lexi again, right? It's like that opposition reflex in dogs. When you approach people with hatred, when you approach people with aggression, it's just going to lead to more aggression. It's just going to lead to more hate. It's this cycle that just keeps going. When we find ourselves on opposite sides of some kind of made-up war, when we allow hate to get inside of us, we spew out that hate onto somebody else. And even when we have a good point, even if it's something that we maybe are right about, that person is not going to respond to that. They're just going to have that reflex, that opposition reflex. And then there's more hatred, and there's more aggression, and more hatred, and more aggression, and more hatred, and more aggression. And what happens in the middle of all that as well is that two human beings who are created and bear the image of God get pushed further and further and further and further and further apart and become less and less and less human and become more and more and more object. And the thing about this cycle of hatred is it's not just in your enemy, right? It's not just in the person that you hate. It's not just in the person that hates you. But when we allow hatred to grow, it grows in us as well. Hatred, I remember one time somebody said hatred is like a poison. And the problem is I don't think that's true because you can handle poison as long as you don't ingest it. I think hatred is like acid. When I was a kid, when I was in high school, I got to do this chemistry experiment. We had to do this like huge chemistry project, and I chose to isolate caffeine from coffee and from tea to see which one had more coffee in it, or more caffeine in it. And the only reason that I did it is because I got to work with a whole bunch of really cool acid, and I got to work with now I can't remember the name of it, chloroform, and all of the like Hardy Boys books I had read, there was always chloroform in it, and so I was like really hoping I was going to get a chance to put the chloroform on a rag and maybe knock out one of my classmates. But the chemistry teacher, I think he knew me, so he was very observant when I was using the chloroform. So alas, I didn't get to try that. But anyways, I did get to play with a whole bunch of acid. So here's the thing. I am not a graceful or dainty or I don't have good reflexes. You know, I'm a bit rammy when I work, and so I had a bad habit of splashing the acid. You cannot handle acid without burning yourself. It's kind of what happens with acid. And so I got it all over myself. I got it all over my clothes. My mom couldn't figure out why I would get home and wash my clothes and they would come out and there was all these like holes everywhere and I had all these burns all over myself. So that's what hatred does. Hatred gets everywhere. Hatred corrupts everything that it touches. It burns everything that it touches. And when we let hatred grow inside of us, it kills us. It destroys us, let alone what it does to the other person. Hatred is destructive. It's a poison. So Jesus' solution is love. John chapter 13, starting verse 34, Jesus says, I give you a new commandment. Love each other. You notice it's not that complicated. Here's my commandment. Love each other. Just as I have loved you, so you also must love each other. This is how everyone will know that you are my disciples when you love each other. Man, I quoted this last week. I wish that we could keep this somehow in our minds. I think this might end up being a tattoo for me, somewhere that I can see it when I start getting angry and upset, that we need to love each other. This is how people are going to know that you're my disciples, when you love each other. Not when you go and yell and scream at people. Not when you decide that you're going to protest. Not when you pretend that you're holier than thou. Not when you do all those things. That's not how people are going to know you're my disciple. They're going to know you follow me because you love each other. Martin Buber had this thing, so it was I and it. So I and the other. But then he talked about how instead of that, there's I and thou. Because this I and thou approach is this relational reality. It sees the other person as an equal. It sees them. It restores their humanity. It gives them their humanity. And instead of looking for what you hate in the other person, instead of looking for what you're angry for in the other person, instead of looking for what upsets you in the other person, you actually look for the humanity in that person. More than that, you look for the parts of them that are made in the image of God. You look for what is good in that person. You look actively and intentionally for something to love in that person. You look for common ground. You see their value as being created and loved by God. Now, the problem is that English only really has this one word for love. And we all know it's a problem. We all know it's a problem. Every one of you who ever got involved in your first relationship, you know this is a problem. Do you remember that first time where you started to have feelings for somebody, right? You started to have feelings for somebody else, and there is a point at which you have to have a conversation, and that conversation in English is very difficult because at some point you have to have the I like you conversation. But I like you, right? So I like you, but no, I like you because you don't love them yet. You know you don't love them, but you know that what you feel for them is much bigger than like. So you like, I like, you know. And then because we now put like in all of our sentences, like I like you, right? Maybe you add up the likes, and if you get 10, there's 10 likes, that's love. I don't know. But so you realize how silly it is. And one of the things that bugs me, English has been around for a long time, and we haven't figured this out yet. Like, how come we don't have a better word? Then we got like and we got love, and then you get weird things like infatuation and stuff, but that's not quite right either, right? And so the Bible has all sorts of words for love. There's a ton of them. In the Old Testament, there's the word hesed. This tends to be this committed love, this steadfast love. It's often talked about as the love that God has for us, almost unconditional. It's love that you can count on, love that you know will be there. Psalm 13, the psalmist says, "But I have trusted in your faithful love. My heart will rejoice in your salvation." There's that kind of faithful love idea. Or there's this word raya. And the word raya is more like the friend or like those beginning stages of love, right? Those beginning stages, kind of like raya is their word for like. You know what I mean? Where you're starting to have affectionate feelings for somebody. Song of Solomon 4:7 says this: "You are utterly beautiful, my love, my raya. There's not a single flaw in you." You can see that they like them. We're not just friends, we're not buddies anymore, but we don't know where we're at quite yet. And then there's this word ahava, and the word ahava is like this romantic kind of love, but it's even more deep than that. It's more rich than that. It's when you start to get into commitment. That's the kind of love when you have ahava for somebody else. That's when maybe you start thinking about marriage. Song of Solomon 8:7 famously says, "Rushing waters cannot quench love. Rivers can't wash it away." It's powerful. It's rich. It's deep. It's amazing. Then there's this Hebrew word dode. And dode is that physical, sexual kind of love. And in Proverbs chapter 7, verse 18 says, "Come, let's drink deep of love until morning. Let's savor our lovemaking." I bet you didn't think that was in the scriptures, right? That's risque. I like that passage. Then in the New Testament, you have even more words showing up for love. In the New Testament, you have the word phileo. And phileo is one that most of us know because it's brotherly love. That's where Philadelphia comes from. And it's also the kind of love that often gets talked about when it comes to kind of churches, like the love that people have within a faith community, like here at Vox, the love that we have for each other. Titus chapter 3, Paul sends a message and he says, look, everyone with me greets you. Greet those who love us faithfully. It's that phileo love. Grace be with you all. Then there's this other word in the New Testament, and it's the word agape. And this agape love is this incredibly powerful kind of love. Agape love is the love that we get in 1 Corinthians 13. It's that love is patient, and love is kind and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant. Love does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own. Love is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered. It does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. This love is powerful. It's world-changing. It's the love that comes from God. And in 1 John chapter 4, verse 8, John says that the person who doesn't love does not know God, because God is love. And the love here, this is that word agape. Now, it's kind of an unusual word. There's a lot of people who think that it was actually created by Paul. There's a lot of people who think that this idea of agape love is a Christian concept because it's this love that comes from God. It's this love that comes from an external source. And there's some other examples of it that have showed up over the years, and nobody's entirely sure if they got it from this idea of Christian love, this idea of agape love. But it's this committed love. It's this love that's very active. It's this love that is unconditional. It's this love that doesn't just come and go like so much of what we see in Hollywood, but it's this love that is so much deeper. It's this love that has this huge choice part to it, this part where we have to actively make this choice. But it also has this emotional aspect as well that I think is kind of important. When I was a kid, this love was always described as this thing that you chose. It didn't matter if you felt it, except that when you look at the words, I did a word study on it this past week, and I was looking through all the different times in the New Testament it's used. And there's this emotional aspect to it, so it's a bit of a cop-out to say that it's just a choice. And so then it gets a little bit weird. Like, if I'm supposed to actually feel a sense of love for the people that I come into contact with on a daily basis, how do I do that? How do I make that happen? And so I think that the clue to loving instead of hating is in all of this, I think. So the question that I have to ask ourselves is this: why do we hate? Why do we hate? So I got thinking about it, and I started doing a bunch of research. I read a whole bunch of psychology papers about it this past week. And it turns out that a lot of hate is rooted in this psychological concept of projection. Projection is essentially when we subconsciously take things about ourselves and we project them onto other people. And so, for example, the things that we're afraid about in ourselves, the things that we don't like about ourselves, the things that maybe we hate about ourselves, we take those and we project them onto the other person. We project them, we make them an it, right? Like that it. We take all of this stuff in us and we put it on them, because then that makes them bad and it makes us good. And we're able to hold on to this illusion that we are good people. This illusion that, well, I'm a predominantly good person and other people are sometimes predominantly bad people. And it's this kind of thing that happens at a subconscious level. Essentially, we protect our own sense of righteousness by projecting all of our own unrighteousness onto other people. We protect our sense of being sinless by projecting our sin onto others, or like we talk about at Vox, we take our own brokenness and we project that onto others. And I was resisting it. It seemed really simplistic, but the more I read, the more research I looked at, the more it kept coming up over and over and over again, and it seemed to be something that happened quite a bit. I think there might be something there that we can use practically to make the decisions and to help us to become more loving people. So here's a couple practical ideas I have just to sort of close this up. The first is that we need to examine ourselves, right? When you hate somebody, when you start to feel hatred towards somebody, there's a good opportunity for us to actually just kind of for a second think to ourselves, what is it about myself that I hate so much? What is it about myself that I'm seeing in them that I don't like? And instead of letting your focus be on your hatred towards this other person, instead our focus comes towards ourselves, to about how we can grow and how we can learn. I think this is what Jesus is getting at with all that don't judge stuff. We talked about this a little bit on Thursday night. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 3, after Jesus says, like, judge not lest ye be judged, he goes on and he starts talking and he says, why do you see the splinter that's in your brother's or sister's eye, but you don't notice the log in your own eye? Now, I grew up and I've preached this message on don't be a hypocrite. Don't be a hypocrite. But this past week, as I was thinking about all this other stuff, all of a sudden I realized, what Jesus was actually getting at is Jesus already knew this about us. And Jesus was actually trying to say, look, when you notice the splinter in your brother's eye, that's a clue for you that there's a log in yours. It's not so much about like, look, don't be a hypocrite. It's more like when you notice that, when you see that, that's something for you to say, okay, wait, what is it about me that I'm not paying attention to? This is really bugging me. This is creating an emotional response. Is this something in me that I need to look into? My prayer for this series is not that I'm going to add a whole bunch of rules or like requirements to our shoulders. Like now we all have to try to be loving and joyful and peaceful and patient and kind and all that. That's not what I want to do at all. What I want to do is I'm hoping that these fruit of the Spirit become a way for us to examine ourselves. They become kind of a check in our own hearts and our own lives. Like, are we becoming more loving as we follow Jesus? That's what's happening? Are we seeing more of these fruit of the Spirit growing in our own lives? So we want to do one, we want to examine ourselves. The second thing I think that this reminds us of is we want to reflect on the grace that we have received ourselves. It is so easy to forget that we are all broken. It is so easy to miss all the stuff in us that is not perfect, that is not good, that is not life-giving, that is not wholesome, that is not the fruit of the Spirit. Romans chapter 5, verse 8 is a verse that so many of us memorized, those of us who grew up in the church. And it says, but God shows his own love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And for a lot of us, we read that verse and we're like, man, God loves me. That's how much God loves me. Isn't that awesome? But the verse says, but while we were still sinners, while we were the ones showing hatred towards God, while we were the ones who were enemies of God, while we were the ones who mistreated God, while we were the ones who cursed God, he loved us that much. So here's the thing I was thinking about. First, show yourself grace and compassion. Show yourself some. Because God showed us grace and compassion. God knew you with all of your brokenness, all of the stuff that you hide from the world around you, all the stuff you're terrified that other people might find out. God knew all of the things you did that are the worst things that you have ever done as a human being. And he loved you that much. He was able to show you grace and compassion. So start by showing yourself some grace and compassion. Because I think if we could learn to love ourselves that way, if we could learn to actually offer ourselves grace, offer ourselves forgiveness, we might not be so quick to need to project that onto other people. God knew we were not going to be able to just try harder. God knew we were not going to be able to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. God knew we were not going to somehow figure out how to fix all of our own brokenness. He knew that he was going to have to do it. And so he showed us grace and compassion, and he came to take care of the consequences of sin. So first off, don't kid ourselves about our own brokenness. Face it. Get very familiar with the worst parts of who you are. Don't try to hide it, because the more we try to suppress that and pretend it's not there, I think that that's when that projection begins to happen, because we need to somehow make ourselves believe that it's okay. And then don't forget how much God loves us. If God's able to love us in spite of all that brokenness that we try to hide, then I want to embrace that. I want to remember that. Because I want to actually be able to experience that love. I want to be able to step in to that love. And so we first need to examine ourselves. Then we need to offer grace and compassion to others, because I think compassion is the antidote to hate. And then we need to share the love that we have received. When we realize how much love and grace and mercy we have received, how could we not want to show that to the world around us? And that's this idea of agape. It's this idea of love that comes from who God is, and it fills us. One of the other theories about hatred is there's this idea of projection. But then there's this other idea that I think has some merit as well. It's this other idea that hatred fills a void in us. There's a psychologist named Bernard Golden, and he says this. He says, acts of hate are attempts to distract oneself from feelings such as helplessness, powerlessness, injustice, inadequacy, and shame. It's this idea that we end up allowing ourselves to engage in hate because it distracts us from this emptiness that we're feeling. Because we were created to be loved by God. And when you and I don't live our lives that way, when we don't live our lives being loved by God, we end up leaving room when that space is not filled by that love from God, then we end up spilling hatred. But when we let ourselves truly receive the love that God has for us, then that love begins to spill out of us. The more I feel loved, the easier it is for me to love others. The more I'm reminded that in spite of all of my failings, which are great, God still loves me. The easier it is for me to overlook the failings and brokenness in others. The easier it is for me to, instead of going to hatred when I experience hatred, it's easier for me to go to love, because that's what's inside me. That's what's going to spill out. And so this morning, that's my encouragement for all of us. My encouragement for all of us is to let ourselves be filled with love rather than hate. And then when we find ourselves cultivating hate in our lives, that we need to step back from that and remind ourselves that that's not what we were created for. We were created to love and be loved. And so I want to leave us all with the words from Jude's letter. In Jude chapter 2, where it says, "May mercy and peace and love be multiplied in you." That's my hope for Vox. My hope for Vox is that mercy and peace and love is multiplied in us and through us. That we are a place where hate comes to die and where love is born. Let me just pray, and then we're going to just sing a couple more songs. So.